signed contract should not become a dead document. It should become usable business intelligence. Today, on the orchestration layer, we're talking about moving from contract chaos to contract intelligence, turning static contracts into usable business information. I'm Brandon Jessup, Chief Delivery Officer at Cimplifi, and I'm joined by Charles Post, Executive Vice President of AI Contracts Orchestration, Matt Durney, Senior Vice President of AI Contract Orchestration, and Sashi Valavala, SVP of Applied Legal AI. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Great to see you. All right, well, let's jump right in here and talk about contract chaos. So in the intro, you heard contract chaos to contract intelligence. Charles, why don't you kick us off and tell us what we're referring to when we say contract chaos?
When we're referring to contract chaos, what we're describing is really a pervasive, market problem, which is that organizations don't have line of sight of really two primary things: where their contracts are in totality and what's in their contracts as it relates to their business. The great irony is that organizations spend, millions, if not tens of millions of dollars every year negotiating contracts for the lifelines of their business, and they don't know what's in them. And so this is just another, leg in the Tower of Babel at organizations, creating to that chaos and creating, quantitative, monetative inefficiency.
So what's the impact? Why do businesses care? What's the impact to businesses when this chaos exists?
Well, generally speaking, it's not one thing. It's a totality of things, right? As the business is run, it's run inefficiently. And so things that are not efficient is your understanding what rights you have in agreements and being able to exercise those options and make better decisions. What we call it here is deployable action. How do we act quickly based upon the information that we have that we can rely upon? And when organizations have their data, locked away in PDFs, in multitude of different custodians or repositories and locations, there isn't an ability to get answers to questions that relate to the day-to-day running of business.
So, Charles, one of the things that you alluded to a moment ago was that this isn't just about having all of your contracts in one place. And so I'm understanding that the problem isn't just about consolidating them. It's actually about getting information that's usable out of them. So why don't we talk about contracts as data here a little bit? So if you would, discuss for us the difference between storing contracts and structuring the terms inside of those contracts as usable data.
Sure. Organizations over time have changes in personnel. They merge, they amalgamate, they divest. And so over time, organizations kind of contract memory, the data around what deals they've made in their arrangements have become scattered, right? Or they become, the duty or obligation of an individual within a specific department because they were the last person there to do it. And that's over time how it's handed off. And so, any processes that needed contract data are usually tailored within a specific business. So just to give you a big picture, right now, organizations need data. They do it inefficiently. And what do they need data for? They need to understand pricing. They need to be able to onboard clients. They need to be able to do a number of different things. But where this data is stored and this contracts is stored are in PDFs, GIF files, JPEG files, images. They're not finalized in Word docs. They lost them. We've seen things, right? Microfiche and microfilm, or they're locked in paper. And so these different modalities are not make it usable for supporting the business. And so one, centralizing that data, putting into usable formats, right? Searchable PDFs or even text files, and then being able to structure it so you can, in a single place, extract information, normalize it for your business purposes and use it within that system of record, within that single data lake is kind of the goal. And to be able to use that data, what is it for? Dates, start dates, obligations, renewals, et cetera. There's about, there's in some agreements, thousands of data points that are necessary for being able to monitor not just the relationship, but the activity and the ongoing basis of that relationship. Organizations are starting to being able to look and see how can they leverage data from contracts and how do they store that more properly.
Yeah, so two issues here: the storage of it, bringing it all into one place, and then getting into a position where you can extract that data out in a meaningful and consistent way. And we'll get into that here shortly. But Matt, let's pull you into the conversation here a little bit. within the client environment, how does that difference show up in practice? And I mean between, contract chaos and having actual usable information.
So, a boots on the ground perspective for this is there's a crawl, walk, run approach to it. And the AI extraction piece is that middle step. And what you're trying to get to is the accessibility to normalize data to make it actionable. And so what we see in practice is you have to have a methodology to extract the data, and you have to have rules and a framework to ensure that that data is useful downstream, but that it's accessible to the correct stakeholders at the moment in time when they need that to either plug revenue leakage or to make an actionable decision on something that has commercial viability constraints to it.
So this is very interesting for me. So we say, hey, it's really important. And I think for me coming into this, I might have said, well, grab all of those contracts, put them in one place. We'll point, quote unquote, the AI at it, and we'll get everything we need. The AI is going to go in and extract this information out of these contracts. But Sashi, I think maybe this is a good point in the conversation here to pull you in and talk a little bit about why it's important, or why AI might need this centralized and structured foundation that Matt's referring to in order to do effective contract analytics.
Yeah, so it's when you're pointing the model towards the data and you're asking a question, the model to respond to you, it is dependent on what the model is being pointed to. And if I ask a question and it's pointing to one folder, and Matt asks the same question, it's pointing to a different folder, now you're getting different answers. Now, that's not a model problem, that's a data problem. I mean, this is where the centralization becomes critical, right? So what centralization solves is everybody has the same baseline and have the same data governance. So you get the right responses back, regardless of who is asking the question within the organization. The structure solves the second problem, which is, can I compare this? Because that comparison is also part of everyday user use cases. So when extracting, what Charles talked about earlier, about extracting the proper metadata from these contracts and making them available for the AI to query solves that second problem, which is, can I compare to some baseline? So having centralization and structure to it is what makes the AI powerful, and the intelligence that you're getting from the data.
So I want to dig into this a little bit more, because I think we're going to have listeners who hear this and just go, well, I don't understand. Like, why can't I just say, point the AI at this consolidated folder? What's the importance of actually extracting information out of those contracts instead of just telling the AI, go look at all these contracts and give me an answer?
I think if we were to define AI orchestration, it's really, where do you systematically and appropriately put AI within a framework, within a workflow, within the ecosystem? So to Sashi's point, you have to have a system of record or a system of truth for the underlying data pool. That lake becomes, your centralized place of that Q&A. But when you're doing the dynamic question and answer using AI tools, you want to log, save, normalize, transpose, and then port out those answers to an appropriate place that you're not asking the same question over and over again to get the same or similar answer, right? You want to have a standardized set of answers that can be used downstream repeatably, low token costs, et cetera. And you're not reinventing the wheel with every application or cycle of AI. So it's important to think about an end-to-end holistic view pointed at what the outcome should be, and then you back into the technology layering and sequencing.
Matt, I think you've touched on something here that should be compelling as we go through this conversation, which is, I may be able to take the AI and say, look at these 2,000 documents, these contracts, or these million contracts, or however many you have. Go look at all of these contracts and extract out information. But when I do that, I'm paying for that as well. I'm paying for the AI to now go in and look at whatever number of documents I have. And so I think one of your points is we extract all of that information out. Now we have that consolidated by the information type across the different contracts. And so that's useful on one front because we're spending less money going and finding the answers. We're just essentially finding the answer once, and now that answer is queryable. Is that right, Matt? Is that one of the takeaways here?
The corporation or the end client that wins in this game is not the one that uses AI the most. It's the one that uses AI the best. And so you want to have an efficient approach to that application. The other part of this is that there's some element of persona-based control that you need to account for, So not every user is going to have the same access to the same documents, the same data pool. So you need to think of that defensibility in terms of access, security, role-based account controls. That type of methodology is part of the system. So when you're talking about Q&A, and yes, AI is an incredibly high power tool to get those answers, you have to decide who has access to those answers, when do they have access, and are those answers formatted in a way that's most appropriate and useful downstream. So there's a lot to consider, and that's why you have to think about the end goal as much as the front end inputs.
Sashi, when we talk about AI, in the past we've had conversations about the difference between, is it probabilistic versus deterministic?
That's right. It is the probabilistic versus deterministic. And the contract data, once you have extracted the structured metadata elements from the contracts, it behaves much more like a deterministic model because there is predictability in the clauses in the agreements, which makes the question and answer sessions much more deterministic, even when you're using a generative AI, which is more of a probabilistic technology models.
And so if I went into all of these contracts and I asked the question a certain way, and maybe you ask it slightly differently, we may have the same answer in mind, but we may not get the same answer if all we're doing is querying all of those underlying contracts versus treating that as structured data, extracting that out, and now having sort of those almost ready-made answers that then we're just tapping into.
That's exactly right. So think of it like prose, right? Like if you have a contract that spells out 30 days versus 30, you want that to be structured. You want that to be normalized. So when anyone asks a question, it returns that exact same response back. And so having normalized data, having structured data makes it that much more predictable. And contracts by nature are predictable documents because of what is in these agreements that is universal to some extent.
Yeah. Charles, I think as we talk about some of the value for having this approach where we're taking these contracts and we're extracting out this structured information, talk to me a little bit about the business value here. Why are we doing that?
Yeah, I'll give you a good example and use the example like a lease agreement. And Sashi mentioned 30 days or something, right? So structured data is really valuable when you can combine it with other data, right? So if you can take a structured data and you can use it, let's talk about a lease agreement. Let's talk about the amount, how much the lease is, and the duration, right? And when it begins. Those are 3 data points, which sound like a lot like coordinates and quantities, right? That have to go into systems like InfoLease, which is a lease monitoring system. And they have to go into lease obligation dashboards to monitor the lease and when the renewal is. And it goes into the invoicing system to make sure that the invoice for the rent is sent out of the receipt. So 3 data points are used in 4, 5, 6 different ways. Why would an organization extract it 6 times, normalize it 6 times, maintain it in 6 ways? It's just inefficient. So organizations, as Matt was alluding to earlier around having a proper process with a QC, is if you can build out within a data lake, right, a structured data center, right, a structured data manufacturing center, where you are building out data and then dispersing that data via API, MCP, wherever, into the different areas where those different data points are needed, but they're being packaged and normalized up. And you can do that on an ongoing basis. The value to the business is what I just described. The amount of time, effort, inefficiencies, the human error involved, the machine error being involved in doing something 6 times on the same data point.
So Matt, we've discussed the application of AI post-contract execution. Is there an opportunity here for net new contracts?
Yeah, it's a great question. So most of what we've discussed so far is AI pointed backwards at the legacy set, that post-execution set for contract data extraction at scale. But that same tooling can potentially be used to solve tomorrow's problem or today's problem, basically solving challenges for that same data extraction, but on a go-forward basis, live dynamically within the frameworks that you build out. This is where implementation architecture methodology, taking a holistic view, really includes things like tool selection. Is it extensible? Can it point forward as well as backwards to give your business the greatest outcome? So this is where contract lifecycle management and those workflows and AI orchestration within a workflow really become paramount.
Interesting. Thank you, Matt. So I think that's a good point you bring up about CLM. So Charles, talk to us about CLM. In the age of AI, what does this mean for CLM?
The platform changed after 2023. So prior to 2023, most CLMs were hard-coded platforms, and all the newer CLM platforms are more native and have quote-unquote embedded AI in them, where pre-2023 have generally they're going to have wrappers or AI wrapped around them for the purposes of doing different activities, which means like an API call. What does that mean for what does AI mean for CLM? It's only going to enhance CLM. That's what it means. It's going to enhance it. How is it going to enhance it? Well, for the record, most CLMs have already had AI before. So now they're going to have more capabilities with AI. And the question also is workflow, right? Do you need to have baked workflow in, or you want to use AI as agents to use workflow? And so I think that like in the world of AI, delivering agentic AI as part of creating an agentic workflow is very similar to a CLM workflow, if not the same thing for the same purpose. So in the future, what that means is CLM is going to look different. It's going to be more agentic. It's going to be more embedded. It's not going to be wrapped. And I think that's where the industry is headed, which means, in terms of implementation, there's more opportunities for configuration, more opportunities for efficiency. Just a few examples: automatically running a red line when a document comes in on a third-party paper, and then teeing up the comments automatically within the CLM, and then figuring out who else needs to be sent to based upon the comments from the playbook in totality as a recommendation to that first user, right? That first pass user. Now, the first pass user just had 80% of the work done for them. Now it keeps them on analysis. But remember, AI is not necessarily dispositive of every answer. It's not always correct. You have to treat it somewhat like spell check in Word, right? It accelerates you to find out where to focus on the different points, but it's not there to tell you that conclusion, right? Like I wouldn't press accept all. In AI, you wouldn't press accept all either, but it's going to help you accelerate towards that answer. And for the ROI for the client, it's time to revenue, time to value, time to onboarding. And that all really matters in that scenario, whether it's a vendor onboarding and client, customer, etc.
So thank you, Charles. Matt, that's interesting. You brought up CLM. So CLM's not dead.
No, CLM is evolving. For any enterprise organization, you're going to have the requirement that you have to have a workflow. It has to have guardrails. There has to be a process in place to create that defensibility and that audit capability around it. Nothing can go from point A to C without, some internal checks and gates. And so CLM evolving really just means AI incorporated within that workflow is giving you more horsepower. It's creating more automation. It's reducing manual inputs and manual efforts around that process. So in the third-party risk management example, all of the risk flagging that we do, whether that was used as part of an AI project for remediation, looking at the backbook, those same capabilities can be pointed at the document that's being worked today, the live transaction. And that live transaction is going to benefit from all of that legal and business intelligence so that you're making quicker decisions today. You're automating some of that routing, who's involved in the process, but ultimately you're keeping it within the confines and within the guardrails of a process that benefits your organization and that, meets your risk tolerances. We work with a lot of highly regulated industries and within these spaces, there's an element of speed, but that speed can't be at the cost of reliability or accuracy.
And we talked a little bit earlier about risk and management of risk. Charles, I think you did a good job of just talking about how everything is a balance, right? How much time do we put into this? How much investment is there? How much risk is there? Anything you would add on the risk management front and maybe how that relates differently to different industries?
So I think part of the big issue for organizations today, really in-house corporates, right, specifically, is they have a hard time articulating what the risk is. And I have, again, my way of thinking about it and my perspective is kind of simplistic. All the capabilities of what AI can do are also its risks, right? It can draft a contract. It can write in Salesforce. So the risks and the benefits have to be weighed and balanced, right? All the benefits have to be weighed and balanced against the risks. And we have to say, what's the risk of these things going, what can they do versus the benefit of the automation? And these are all trade-offs that are going to be different in each organization, but these are all the risk-based outcomes that matter with AI, right? You're not getting a perfect answer. You're getting a risk-based answer.
And that's where that AI orchestration, that consultative value add is coming in, where somebody is looking at that and helping you to navigate that equation, right? That risk reward balance.
And it's three-dimensional chess at the end of the day, right? So what you're balancing is not just the risks within the program itself, but it's within your work product, within your organization, and all the IP and all the data within your organization. And the third pillar, right, is everything that's external to the organization and what you can connect to, right, including applications. So there's really this the art of the possible has to be weighed and understood. And so it's a really tricky thing to see. And I think there'll be a lot of organizations that are really just learning as they go along, and they'll have an evolving risk-based program.
So, Matt, I keep going back to this notion of the human in the loop, right? The AI orchestration. So do you want to talk a little bit about that interplay, the harmony between those two and how that works?
So there's a couple of things. On one layer, the use of AI is incredibly powerful, but, like Charles has alluded to, trust but verify. There's an aspect where that human judgment is still mission critical to ensure that you're meeting the standards of the organization, that everything is like passing the correct test, even beyond what the AI might flag for you automatically. And then the second layer to this, which is something that is relatively unspoken, is the change management aspect of implementing any of this technology. So the application of AI is very powerful to the extent that you have the governance structure, the frameworks, the processes, and the internal controls to make that application appropriate, efficient, and then defensible, obviously. So the human in the loop is a human in the loop in terms of AI output validation, but it's also in terms of how are we going to make this process ours? How are we going to make this application of AI a utility for the organization and actually confer real benefit to the organization? So you need the driver in the car still on some level, and this is just a faster car.
Matt, I want to come back to you for a second. So what does this look like for a business when you're going in and you're trying to solve some of these real problems, these real business problems?
All of this is academic and hypothetical unless you can prove accurate results. And so there's a trust factor and a veracity factor that you have to build into it. And the only way to do that is a combination of things. On the front end, prompt engineering, your model building, your custom model extraction protocols, et cetera, your methodology around that has to be very robust. That usually includes, subject matter experts to help get the correct answer. And then on the back end, there's a validation layer. So there has to be that QC, that validation, precision, recall, F1 scoring. There's a scientific approach that happens after the sort of artful and artistic, creative, as well as scientific methodology to get the correct answers. Once you get over that bridge and the business can rely on the answers, then to Charles's point, that data becomes available, trustworthy, and it can move downstream. It becomes extensible. And so what we see at organizations is, number one, you have to define the data at the outset of the project. There has to be a data dictionary. There has to be a common understanding of what we're looking for and what it should look like.
So you've mentioned, I think a few times there, Matt, this notion of trust and defensibility. And so, we are operating in environments where this is really critical, right? It's legal, it's procurement, financial. And so why isn't it enough for us to just say the AI validated it, right? The AI said so.
Yes, it's a great point. So, we work a lot in the third-party risk management world, right? Procurement use case in particular, which is a horizontal use case. It applies basically to every corporation. Depending on what type of corporation you are, you may be highly regulated. Where it's highly regulated, the increased stakes and sort of protocols around that have a lot of requirements that are pushed down onto the business folks that exist in this space. And so having credible, accurate answers is really paramount to the business from a risk compliance perspective, as well as, that's operational risk, among other things. But it's also like, what are the commercial terms? What's the exposure? Are we compliant with our policies, et cetera? It's like the burden of truth that you have to get out of the AI tools is pretty high. And to get there requires a certain set of skills and methodologies and, really a governance structure on how you use AI to get there.
It requires orchestration, right?
This
orchestration layer, it's a common theme and something we've talked about a lot, obviously, on this podcast. Sashi, I want to talk just a little bit from the technology side of things. What should people be thinking about? What should teams be thinking about in terms of governance, human validation, auditability?
Yeah. So on the audit side, I think we touched upon this earlier here as well, to say that the permissions has to be baked into your orchestration. So there's employment data, there is contract data, there are dollar amounts involved. So it has to be appropriate to the users, and that has to be part of the layering when we design these systems. So that has to be paramount. The other part about the human validations, it's not about more or less of human validation. It's about bringing the human validations to the appropriate place, in the sense that where the consequences are higher. For example, if you have a high dollar amount contract, you want humans to come in and validate that the data that you extracted, the normalization of the data, and the results that you are getting back from structured prompts or even unstructured prompts, and that it is valid and it is grounded in the truth. So that's the part I would say about validations. All the metrics that Matt talked about, those are paramount in the sense that because this is a predictable data models, we want this to be as precise as well as like high precision and high recall modeling. And that's the crux of it from the data validation side.
Thank you, Sashi. So Matt, precision recall, these sound familiar to folks who may be listening who are more on the e-discovery side of a business. This comes up in your contract work. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, of course. So, the question is, does the content exist in the contract? Yes or no? And if it exists, did we find just that content? Did we overcapture? If we're looking for a singular date, did we get two dates and do they diverge? That becomes a lack of truth, right? You can't have two different correct answers for the same data point. So when we look at precision recall, there's obviously a little bit of balancing that goes into that, casting a wide net, but looking for the gauge on that net to just catch the correct fish. There's some balancing work that has to go into it.
Charles, for a leader whose contract data is fragmented today, what should their first step be to try to resolve this?
Well, my email is charles.post@cimplifi.com, and I'm easily reachable to discuss that first step with you. I'm just joking. But that being said, you want to go after the low-hanging fruit that are watermelons. You want to think about the revenue-generating contracts in procurement where you're spending a lot or you're procuring a lot from direct or indirect supply chains, and be able to look at client lists, look at vendor lists, use your other data to help, triangulate where the best value is to go after. And that's where you're going to find, right, the most bang for your buck in terms of AI and contract data.
Thank you, Charles. Matt, what would you add from the implementation side?
Yeah, I think Charles nails it. I think one thing to keep in mind is you start with the use case and then you build business requirements. And then the business requirements are going to determine what functional requirements you need to get to that solution. And then as you're looking at functional requirements, that's where you bring in the layered tech stack. So what's fit for purpose? What's going to give you the greatest efficiency gains, accuracy? What really makes sense? What AI can you deploy? And then you start to get into that conversation of what subject matter experts do you need, whether internally or externally, to get that job done.
Thank you, Matt. All right, Sashi, you're going to close us out here. One sentence. What should teams remember when they're putting AI on top of contracts?
Yeah, AI is most valuable when data foundations and workflows are designed for the outcomes you need. This is not a search assistant that we are building. We want this AI to be part of the workflow.
Well, if your organization is sitting on thousands of contracts, but is still answering basic questions manually, that is not just a contract management issue. It is an opportunity to turn legal documents into trusted business intelligence. This is the orchestration layer, where legal data, AI, and operations come together to create outcomes you can trust.